I knew something was wrong the moment the doctor wouldn't meet my eyes. The room smelled like antiseptic and something colder, like truth waiting to be spoken, and I sat there on the crinkling paper of the exam table with my hands locked together in my lap, trying to remember the last time my life had felt like it belonged to me, because somewhere between double shifts and unpaid bills and my father's silence, I had stopped being in control of anything at all, and now this stranger in a white coat was about to tell me something that would take even more away. "Emily," she said softly, and my name sounded different in her voice, heavier, like it carried consequences. "You're pregnant," and for a second I just stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to correct herself, because that wasn't possible, it couldn't be, not with the life I was living, not with the choices I hadn't made, and the first words that came out of my mouth didn't sound like mine at all, thin and cracked. "That's impossible," but she didn't argue, didn't push, just gave me that look people give when they already know you're about to fall apart, and suddenly the room felt too small, like the walls were closing in inch by inch, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat, loud and uneven, like it was trying to warn me that this wasn't just a mistake, this was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to escape. 3 weeks earlier, my biggest problem had been whether I could cover rent with tips from a slow Tuesday shift, whether my father would remember to show up sober for once, whether the old Honda I drove would make it another mile without breaking down on some empty stretch of road. Normal problems, manageable problems, the kind you could survive if you just kept moving forward, but that night changed everything. The night someone knocked on our door like they owned it, not a polite knock, not a neighbor asking for help, but something harder, sharper, like a demand instead of a request, and I remember standing there in the dim light of our living room, barefoot on cold hardwood, my breath caught somewhere between curiosity and fear, because instinct told me not to open. It told me nothing good ever arrived after midnight, but my father was already moving, already stumbling toward the door with that look on his face I hadn't seen in years, not anger, not confusion, but something worse, something like recognition, and when the door finally opened, the air in the room shifted, like the world outside had just stepped in without asking permission, and he stood there, tall and still and completely out of place in our broken little apartment, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard, who didn't need to move to be obeyed, dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than everything we owned combined, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe, and his eyes found mine before they found my father, calm and unreadable, like he was measuring something only he understood, and in that moment, before a single word was spoken, before I knew his name or what he wanted or how deeply he would change my life, I felt it, that quiet, terrifying certainty, that whatever was about to happen next wasn't a choice, it was a decision that had already been made, and I was just now catching up to it. My father did not say a word at first, and that silence scared me more than anything, because he was never quiet, not when he drank, not when he lied, not when he tried to pretend everything was under control, but now he just stood there with his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the floor like a man waiting for a sentence he already knew he deserved, and the man in the suit stepped inside without asking, his shoes making almost no sound against the worn wood, his presence pulling all the air out of the room until I felt like I had to fight just to breathe, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be obeyed. "Marcus Carter," he said, like my father's name was something he owned, "you have been avoiding me," and my father swallowed hard, his hands shaking at his sides. "I just needed more time," he muttered, but even I could hear how weak it sounded, how empty, and the man tilted his head slightly. As if he had expected that answer, as if he had already decided it would not matter. "You had 6 months, he replied, and there was no anger in his tone, no frustration, just fact, like he was reading numbers off a page. "Time is not what you owe me," and that was when I felt it, the shift, the moment everything turned toward me, because his eyes moved from my father to me again, slow and deliberate, and I had the strange, sinking feeling that I had been part of this conversation long before I even knew it existed. "What is he talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, because fear always came out sounding like anger with me, but my father did not answer, he just kept staring at the floor, and the man in the suit stepped closer, not threatening, not rushed, just certain, and I could see him clearly now, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the silver threaded through his dark hair, the kind of presence that did not fade with age but sharpened, became something heavier, something harder to ignore. Your father entered into an agreement, he said, looking directly at me, not at my father, like I was the one who needed to understand. He failed to honor it, and my stomach tightened, because I knew what that meant, even if no one said the word out loud. Debt, something we never had enough money to escape, something that always followed us no matter how hard I worked, how many shifts I picked up, how many nights I came home too tired to think. How much? I asked, already dreading the answer, and my father let out a broken sound that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, and the man answered instead, $2 million, and the number hit me like cold water. Too big to understand, too big to fix, too big to survive. That is not possible, I said, shaking my head, because it had to be a mistake, it had to be something else. But the man did not argue, did not correct me. He just watched me with that same steady gaze, like he was waiting for me to reach the only conclusion that mattered. And when I finally looked at my father, really looked at him, I saw it there, the truth he had been hiding, the weight he had been carrying alone, and something inside me dropped, something that told me this was real, all of it, and that there was no version of this where I could just walk away. We will find a way to pay it, I said quickly, the words coming out before I had a plan, before I had anything except desperation. But the man shook his head once, slow, final. No, he said, and then, after a brief pause that felt like the world holding its breath, he added, the debt has already been settled. And for a second I felt relief, sharp and sudden, like maybe this was over before it even began. But then he looked at me again, and that feeling vanished just as quickly as it had come, because there was something in his eyes now, something that made my skin prickle, something that made me understand, without him having to say it yet, that whatever he had taken instead of money, it was not something my father could ever get back, and it was not something I had ever agreed to give. The room went so quiet I could hear the ticking of the cheap clock on the wall, each second louder than the last, like it was counting down to something I did not understand yet but already felt trapped inside. And I stared at him, at the way he stood there so composed, so certain, like nothing in this world could surprise him, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted. What do you mean, settled? And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not softness, not kindness, but intention, like he had been waiting for that exact question. It means, he said, each word measured, controlled, your father no longer owes me money. And I nodded slowly, because that part one understood, that part one wanted to believe was good, but there was something missing, something he was not saying, and my chest tightened as I forced the next words out. Then what does he owe you? And he did not look at my father when he answered. He looked at me, directly at me, like I was the only one in the room who mattered. You, he said simply, and for a second I did not process it. The word just hung there between us, too small for what it meant, too simple for how heavy it felt. No, I said immediately, shaking my head before my mind could catch up. No, that is not how this works. People are not things, you cannot just. But he raised one hand, not to stop me, not to silence me, just enough to make me pause, and somehow it worked, my voice cutting off mid-sentence like it had been pulled away. This is exactly how it works, he replied, calm as ever. When agreements are broken, alternatives are enforced. And I felt anger rise up through the fear, sharp and desperate, because this was wrong, all of it was wrong. I did not agree to anything, I snapped, taking a step back, putting space between us like it would make a difference, like distance could undo what had already been decided. You are not part of the original agreement, he said, almost thoughtfully, like he was acknowledging a detail, not a person. But you are the resolution. And I turned to my father then, searching for something, anything, a denial, a protest, a sign that he would stop this, that he would say this was not happening. But he still would not look at me, his eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder. And that was when the truth settled in, slow and suffocating. He had already agreed, maybe not with words, maybe not out loud, but in every choice he had made that led us here. He had already given me away. Say something, I whispered, my voice breaking despite everything I tried to hold together. Dad, tell him this is not real. But he just shook his head once, barely, and that tiny movement felt louder than any scream, because it was the closest thing to an answer I was going to get. And the man in front of me stepped closer again, not threatening, not rushed, just inevitable, like gravity, like something that could not be argued with or avoided. "You will come with me," he said, not a question, not a demand, just a statement of what was going to happen next, and I wanted to refuse. I wanted to run, I wanted to do anything except stand there and let my life be decided by someone else, but my feet would not move, my body caught between fear and disbelief. And then he added, almost as an afterthought, "There will be a ceremony," and my heart dropped into my stomach, cold and heavy, because I knew what that meant before he said it, knew it in the way my breath hitched and my hands clenched at my sides. "A marriage," he finished, his voice steady, unshaken. "It will make everything official," and the word official echoed in my head like a closing door, like the final click of something locking into place. And all I could think, the only thought that made it through the panic rising in my chest, was that I had just gone from worrying about rent and broken cars and late shifts to something so much bigger, so much darker, something I could not outrun, could not fix, could not wake up from, because this was not a misunderstanding, this was not a mistake, this was a decision, and somehow, without ever being asked, I had already been chosen. I did not remember walking to the car, only the sound of the door closing behind me and the way the night air felt colder than it should have, like I had stepped into a different version of my life without noticing when the change happened, and the vehicle waiting outside was nothing like the one I had driven to my shift that morning, sleek and black and silent, the kind of car that did not belong on our street, the kind that made people look twice and then look away, and he opened the door. For me himself, not out of politeness, not out of courtesy, but because there was no version of this where I was not getting in, and I hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel my heart slam against my ribs, just enough to imagine what it would look like if I turned and ran, barefoot down the sidewalk, past the broken streetlight and the empty houses, but the image did not go far, it never did, because something in me already knew I would not make it more than a few steps before the reality of my situation caught up to me, and he waited, not impatient, not pressing, just watching, like he already understood the outcome, and that was what made it worse, that quiet certainty, like my choice had already been removed before I ever had the chance to make it. So I got in, my hands trembling slightly as I pulled the door closed behind me, and the inside of the car was warm, controlled, the faint scent of leather and something expensive filling the air, a world away from everything I had known, and he took the seat beside me, not across, not distant, close enough that I could feel the shift in the space around me, like the air itself adjusted to his presence. And the driver said nothing, just pulled away from the curb as if this had all been scheduled, as if my life had been rearranged hours before I even knew it was happening. I stared straight ahead at first, at the passing streetlights blurring into streaks of gold against the window, trying to hold on to something familiar, something that still felt like mine, but the further we drove, the less anything outside looked like the world I recognized, the streets wider, the buildings taller, the silence inside the car heavier, and I finally turned to him, unable to keep the questions locked inside any longer. "You cannot do this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Because anger was easier to hold onto than fear. "You cannot just take someone and decide their life for them," and he did not look at me right away, his gaze fixed forward, calm and unreadable, before he finally spoke. "I am not deciding your life," he said, his tone even, almost detached. "I am resolving a problem," and something about the way he said it made my stomach twist, because to him, that was all this was, a transaction, a solution, something to be handled and completed without hesitation, and I shook my head, pushing back against the words, against the reality they carried. "I am not a solution," I replied, my voice rising despite my efforts to keep it controlled. "I am a person," and this time he did look at me, fully, his eyes sharp and focused in a way that made it hard to hold his gaze for long. "Yes," he said quietly, "you are," and for a second, just a second, there was something else there, something I could not quite name, something that did not fit with the rest of him, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same steady certainty, and "You will be treated as one," he added, and I let out a short, humorless breath, because nothing about this felt like being treated as anything other than a possession. "By forcing me into a marriage," I challenged, and he did not react to the accusation, did not defend it, did not deny it, just let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. "By ensuring you are protected," and the word protected landed differently than I expected, softer, heavier, like it carried a meaning I did not yet Understand, and I opened my mouth to argue again, to tell him I did not need protection, that I had survived just fine on my own, but the words caught somewhere between my thoughts and my voice, because part of me, a small, inconvenient part, knew that survival was not the same as safety, and the car slowed as we turned through a set of gates I had not even seen until they opened, tall and imposing, separating the world I knew from the one I was being pulled into, and as we drove up the long, winding path toward a house that looked more like something out of a movie than a place people actually lived, I felt it settle in, deeper this time, heavier, the realization that this was not temporary, not a misunderstanding that could be cleared up or undone. This was something real, something binding, something that would not end with a conversation or a refusal. And when the car finally came to a stop, and the engine fell silent, and he reached for the door again, I understood one thing. With absolute clarity, this was not just the moment my life changed, this was the moment it stopped belonging to me at all. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel out of place, like my footsteps on the polished floor did not belong there, like I did not belong there, and I hesitated just inside the entrance as the door closed behind me with a soft, final click that echoed louder than it should have, sealing something I could not see but could already feel tightening around me, and everything about the space was wrong in the same way. Too clean, too controlled, every surface reflecting soft light from fixtures that probably cost more than my yearly rent. Every detail arranged with intention, like nothing here happened by accident, and I stood there in my worn jeans and wrinkled shirt, suddenly aware of every imperfection, every thread out of place, like I had been dropped into someone else's life without warning. "This is where you will stay," he said from behind me, his voice steady, unhurried, as if we were discussing something simple, something ordinary, and I turned slowly to face him, trying to hold on to the anger that had kept me standing this long, because if I let it slip, I was not sure what would replace it. "I am not staying," I replied, even though the words felt weaker now, thinner, like they had already been worn down by everything that had happened in the last hour, and he did not argue. Did not raise his voice, just studied me for a moment in that same quiet way that made me feel seen and assessed at the same time. "You are," he said, not dismissive, not forceful, just certain, like gravity again, like something that did not require agreement to be true. A woman appeared from somewhere deeper in the house then, older, composed, her posture straight and her expression neutral in a way that told me she had seen things like this before, or at least things she did not question, and she gave a small nod in his direction before turning her attention to me. "Miss Carter," she said politely, as if this were an introduction at a formal event and not the beginning of something I had never agreed to, "I will show you to your room," and I almost laughed at that, at the absurdity of it, at the idea that I was being escorted anywhere like a guest when nothing about this felt voluntary, but the sound never made it past my throat, because he was still watching, still there, and something about his presence made it hard to react the way I wanted to, like my instincts were being overridden by something quieter, heavier. I followed her because I did not know what else to do, because standing still felt worse, because movement at least gave me the illusion of control, and the hallway stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors that all looked the same, each one closed, each one hiding a space I would never be part of, until she stopped in front of one and opened it with a gentle motion, stepping aside to let me pass, and the room inside was nothing like anything I had ever called mine, large and softly lit, a bed that looked untouched, sheets smooth and white, a window that overlooked grounds I could not fully see in the darkness, and I stood there again, just inside the doorway, unable to move further, because this felt just as unreal as everything else, like a set, like something temporary, like I could wake up and find myself back in my apartment with the flickering light and the sound of my father's television in the next room. "You will find everything you need here," the woman said gently, and I almost asked her what that meant, almost asked if there was something in this room that could undo what had already been decided, but the question died before it reached my lips, because I already knew the answer, and when she left, closing the door quietly behind her, the silence returned, heavier now, pressing in from all sides, and I walked slowly to the window, my reflection faint against the glass, a version of myself I barely recognized staring back, and I pressed my hand against the cool surface, grounding myself in something real, something solid, because everything else felt like it was slipping, shifting into something I could not control, and as I stood there, alone for the first time since this had begun, the truth settled deeper, more permanent, not a shock anymore, not a sudden drop, but something steady and unchanging. That this was not a place I had come to temporarily, not a situation that would resolve with time or reason. This was a new reality, one I had been pulled into without warning, and somewhere in the back of my mind, quiet but persistent, a single thought repeated itself over and over again: I did not know how to leave, and worse, I was starting to understand that I might not be allowed to. I did not sleep that night, not really. I lay there staring at the ceiling that was too smooth, too perfect, listening to the silence that felt louder than any noise I had ever known, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the same thing: the door of my old apartment closing behind me, my father not looking at me, his silence louder than any apology he could have given, and then his voice, calm and final, echoing through my head: "You will come with me," like it had already happened long before I understood it. And sometime just before sunrise, I gave up pretending I could rest and sat up slowly, the sheets cool against my skin, the room unchanged, untouched, like nothing in this house ever shifted unless he decided it would. I found clothes waiting for me, folded neatly on a chair near the bed, not mine, nothing I recognized, soft fabric in neutral tones, simple but expensive in a way I could not fully explain, and I stared at them for a long moment, unsure whether to feel grateful or insulted, because even this, even what I wore now, had been decided for me, and I changed anyway, because I needed something to do, something that felt like action instead of waiting. And when I stepped out into the hallway, it was just as quiet as before, the same endless stretch of doors, the same controlled stillness, like the house itself was holding its breath. I followed the faint sound of movement until I reached a large open space that I realized must be the kitchen, though it looked nothing like any kitchen I had ever been in, more like something out of a magazine: polished surfaces, soft lighting, everything in its place, and the same woman from the night before stood near the counter, preparing something with calm, practiced movements, and she looked up as I entered, her expression composed but not unfriendly. "Good morning, Miss Carter," she said, like this was normal, like mornings here followed rules I had not learned yet, and I hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside, unsure where I was supposed to stand, what I was supposed to do, because nothing here felt like it belonged to me. "You can call me Emily," I said quietly, because hearing my own name like that made me feel like someone else entirely, and she nodded once, accepting it without question. "Of course, Emily," she replied, placing a cup in front of an empty chair. "You should eat," and I almost laughed again. That same hollow sound stuck somewhere inside me, because eating felt like the least important thing right now, like something from another life, but my body disagreed, the exhaustion and shock settling into something heavier, something real, and I moved toward the chair slowly, sitting down because it was easier than standing, easier than thinking. "Where is he?" I asked after a moment, the question slipping out before I could stop it, and she paused just slightly before answering. "Mr. DeLuca handles his business early," she said carefully, like every word had been chosen for a reason. "He will see you later," and I nodded, though the answer did not help, did not change anything, because later could mean anything now, and I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into my fingers, grounding me in something simple, something real, and for a few seconds, I let myself pretend this was just a strange morning, just an unfamiliar place, just a situation that would resolve itself if I waited long enough. "There are rules," she added then, her voice gentle but firm enough to pull me back to reality, and I looked up at her, something in my chest tightening again, because of course there were rules, there were always rules in places like this. "You are free to move within the house," she continued, "but you do not leave the property without permission," and I felt the word settle in, permission, heavy and unmistakable. "And no one will disturb you without cause," she finished, and I almost asked what counted as cause, almost pushed back, but I did not, because I already knew the answer would not change anything, and as I sat there in a kitchen that was not mine, in a house that was not mine, holding a cup I had not chosen, listening to rules I had not agreed to, one thing became painfully clear: this was not temporary, this was not something I could outlast or ignore, this was structure, control, a life already built around me before I even arrived, and somewhere deep inside, beneath The fear and the anger and the confusion, a quieter realization began to form. This was only the beginning, and I had no idea what he expected from me next. The rest of the morning passed in a strange kind of silence, not empty but controlled, like everything in this place moved according to rules I could not see, and I spent most of it walking through the house, not because I was curious, but because I needed to understand the boundaries of the cage I had been placed in, and every room I stepped into felt the same, immaculate, untouched, like no one actually lived here despite the evidence that someone clearly did. And the further I went, the more I realized something unsettling. There were no personal traces, no photographs, no clutter, nothing that told a story about the man who owned all of this, only space and order and control, and it made him feel less human somehow, more like a presence than a person. I found myself back in my room by late afternoon, sitting on the edge of the bed with my hands resting in my lap, staring at nothing, trying to piece together what came next, because there had to be a next step, there had to be something beyond waiting, and that was when I heard it, a soft knock at the door, not loud, not demanding, just enough to pull me back into the moment, and before I could respond, the door opened slowly and he stepped inside. Everything in me went still, my breath catching without permission, because seeing him here, in this space, made everything feel more real, more permanent, and he closed the door behind him with the same quiet precision he seemed to do everything with, his gaze finding me immediately, steady and unreadable. "You have settled in," he said, not a question, just an observation, and I let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because settled was not the word I would have chosen. "Is that what you call this?" I asked, my voice tighter than I wanted, but I did not look away. I refused to look away, and for a moment, something shifted in his expression again, that same brief flicker I had seen before, gone before I could understand it. "Adjustment takes time," he replied, calm as ever, and I shook my head slightly, pushing back against the simplicity of that statement. "This is not an adjustment," I said, standing slowly, forcing myself to match his height as much as I could. "This is you deciding something for me without asking," and he listened, actually listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, just taking in the words like they mattered more than I expected them to, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "If I had asked," he said, "would you have agreed?" And the answer came to me immediately, sharp and certain, "No," and he nodded once, like that confirmed something he had already known, something that made his decision easier. "Then nothing would have changed," he said simply, and the logic of it hit harder than I wanted to admit, because he was right, because asking would not have altered the outcome, and that realization unsettled me more than his control, more than the situation itself, because it meant this had never been about choice, not really. "There will be a ceremony tomorrow," he continued, shifting the conversation forward like it was already decided, like the timeline had been set without me. "Everything will be prepared," and my chest tightened again, that same heavy pressure building. "Tomorrow," I repeated, the word feeling too close, too immediate, like I had lost even more time than I realized. "You do not think I deserve more than a day to process this?" I challenged, and he studied me for a moment, his gaze sharper now, more focused. "Time does not change necessity," he said, and there it was again, that word, necessity, like everything in his world was reduced to what needed to happen, not what should, not what was fair, just what was required. I crossed my arms without thinking, a small act of defiance that felt insignificant even as I did it. "And what happens after?" I asked, because that mattered just as much, maybe more. "What exactly do you expect from me?" And for the first time since he had entered the room, he hesitated, not long, not obvious, but enough for me to notice, enough to make something in my chest shift, because it was the first crack in that perfect control. "You will be treated with respect," he said finally, his voice steady again. "You will be safe here," and I let out a slow breath, because those were not answers, not really, they were promises without details, protection without explanation, and I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to understand the man behind the control, the reason behind the decision, and the question slipped out before I could stop it, softer now, less anger, more confusion. "Why me?" And for a moment, just a moment, the silence between us changed, deepened, like the answer existed somewhere just beneath the surface, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost reflective. "Because you are already part of this," he said. And something in the way he said it sent a chill down my spine, because it sounded less like a choice and more like a fact, less like a decision and more like something that had been set in motion long before either of us stood in this room. And as he turned to leave, his hand pausing briefly on the door, I realized with a sudden, quiet certainty, this was bigger than a debt, bigger than a marriage, bigger than anything I had been told so far, and whatever I had been pulled into, I still did not understand it, not yet. The night stretched longer than it should have, each hour folding into the next until time stopped feeling real, and I sat on the edge of the bed again, in the same place I had been the night before, except everything inside me felt different now, heavier, like something had shifted beneath the surface that I could not name yet, and my mind kept circling back to his words, "You are already part of this," over and over again. Because that was the part that did not make sense, the part that did not fit, and the more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me, because it sounded like something had been decided long before the night he showed up at my door. I tried to remember anything that could explain it, anything from my past that connected to him, to this world, but there was nothing, no hidden connections, no secrets I was aware of, just a life that had always been small and contained, work, home, survival, and yet somehow, that had not been enough to keep me out of this. I stood up suddenly, unable to sit still any longer, pacing the room slowly, my bare feet silent against the floor, trying to push through the confusion, trying to find something solid to hold on to, and that was when it hit me, not as an answer, but as a realization that made my chest tighten, the doctor, the words from that morning, "You are pregnant," and I stopped moving entirely, my breath catching as the thought fully formed, because none of it made sense, not the timing, not the possibility, not the way everything seemed to be aligning in a way that felt too precise to be random. I pressed my hands against the edge of the dresser, grounding myself as the pieces refused to fit together, because I knew my own life, I knew my own choices, and this was not something that should have been happening, not like this, not now, and yet it was real as the walls around me, as real as the situation I had been forced into, and a quiet, unsettling possibility began to take shape, something I did not want to consider but could not ignore, that maybe he knew something I did not. Something that explained why I was here, why this had all happened so quickly, why there had been no hesitation in his decision. A soft knock pulled me out of my thoughts, and I turned toward the door just as it opened, the same woman stepping inside with calm, measured steps, a tray in her hands. "You should eat something," she said gently, placing it on the small table near the window, and I stared at it for a moment before looking back at her, the question already forming before I could stop it. "How long has he known?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more careful, because I was not sure what I was asking anymore, not really, and she paused, just slightly, enough for me to notice, enough to confirm that there was something there, something unspoken. "Mr. DeLuca is a man who prepares in advance," she replied after a moment, her tone even but her words deliberate, and that was not an answer, not directly, but it was enough to make something inside me shift again, because it meant this had not been sudden, not for him, this had been planned, anticipated, set in motion long before I ever realized it was happening. "And me?" I pressed, stepping closer without realizing it. "How long has he known about me, and this time?" Her gaze softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with something closer to understanding. "Longer than you think," she said quietly, and the words settled into the room like a weight, like something final, and I felt it then, not fear exactly, but something deeper, something colder, the realization that I had never been as invisible as I thought, that somewhere, somehow, my life had intersected with his long before that night, long before the debt, long before the decision that brought me here. I turned away from her slowly, my reflection catching in the window again, but this time it felt different, like I was looking at someone I did not fully know, someone whose story had been unfolding without her awareness, and as the silence returned, thick and heavy, one thought settled in with quiet certainty: this was never just about my father's debt, and whatever truth was waiting behind all of this, I was already too far inside to turn back now. Morning came too quickly, or maybe I had not slept at all, because one moment I was standing by the window trying to make sense of everything and the next the light had shifted, pale and quiet, stretching across the floor like a reminder that time was moving whether I understood it or not, and for a few seconds I let myself forget where I was, let myself believe this was just another day, another shift waiting, another version of my life that still belonged to me. But then I saw the dress. It was laid out across the bed, pristine and deliberate, white fabric catching the soft light, simple in design but unmistakable in meaning, and my chest tightened as the realization settled in again, heavier this time, because this was not a conversation, not a possibility, this was happening, today, and I walked toward it slowly, my fingers brushing against the fabric like it might disappear if I did not touch it, like it was not real until I acknowledged it. The door opened without a knock this time, and she stepped inside again, calm as always, like nothing about this day was unusual. "It is time," she said gently, and I nodded before I even knew why, my body moving ahead of my thoughts, because resisting felt pointless now, like pushing against something that would not move no matter how hard I tried, and I changed into the dress in silence, the fabric fitting perfectly. Of course it did, everything here was planned, measured, decided in advance, and when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back, the girl who had worried about rent and tips and broken cars replaced by someone standing on the edge of something much bigger, something she did not understand but could not avoid. The ceremony was smaller than I expected, not grand, not filled with people, just a quiet room and a few witnesses who did not look at me for long, like they knew better than to get involved, and he was already there when I walked in, standing at the front, composed and still, exactly the way he always was, like nothing in this moment affected him at all, and for a second I wondered if he felt anything, if this meant anything to him beyond necessity, beyond resolution, and then his eyes met mine, steady and focused, and something shifted again, that same flicker I had seen before, not enough to understand, but enough to know it was there. I stopped a few feet away from him, my hands clasped together without thinking, the silence stretching between us until someone began to speak, words about agreement and commitment that sounded distant, like they belonged to someone else's story, not mine, and I listened without really hearing, my thoughts pulling in every direction at once, until the moment came, the one that mattered, the one that made everything real, and I felt it before I saw it, the way the air changed, the way my breath caught as he reached for my hand, his touch firm but controlled, not forceful, not hesitant, just certain, and I looked up at him then, searching for something, anything, a reason, an explanation, something that would make sense of all of this. "Why me?" I asked again, my voice barely above a whisper, but it carried, it always did in this silence, and for a moment, just a moment, everything paused, like the world was waiting for his answer, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, but there was something else there now, something deeper, something that made the words land differently than before, because this was never random, he said, his gaze holding mine without wavering, because you were always part of what comes next, and the meaning settled slowly, piece by piece, heavier with each second, because this was not just about a debt, not just about a marriage, not just about control, this was something planned, something inevitable, something that had been set in motion long before I ever realized it existed, and as the final words were spoken and the moment closed around us, I understood one thing with a clarity that cut through everything else. I had not been taken by chance, I had been chosen, and whatever future waited beyond this moment, it had already begun before I ever had the chance to refuse it.